Please welcome Cynthia Mulligan.
Hello, everyone. We are going to get started now. I'm Cynthia Mulligan. I'm the political reporter for City News. I largely work out of Queen's Park, so I am Doug Ford's unofficial stalker at the moment. I'm really delighted to introduce our next speaker, Marissa Nelson. And we've all been talking this morning about the challenges with audience trust, and particularly in the age of social media where everything is scrutinized and questioned, and there's a lot of false information now out there. This is a really important discussion. Marissa Nelson is Vice President of Local Media Consulting at Magid, which is a top media strategy firm in the United States. She and her team work with news organizations right across North America to grow audience, develop content strategies, and improve their products. And Marissa has had more than 20 years of multi-platform journalism experience, including local and network media. And before joining Magid 3 years ago, she led 8 local CBC stations in Ontario with a mix of television, radio, and digital stations. And before that, oversaw digital news operations for CBC. So she is a wealth of knowledge. And she's going to walk us through some of the research that Magid has conducted for the RTDNA in the US. And we'll have a chance to have a thoughtful Q&A right after. Marissa.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. And it's nice to be north of the border, though I do live here. But it's nice to talk to Canadian journalists. So I'm going to walk you through some research we did for RTDNA US. Last year we did a trust study not dissimilar to the one you just saw. And this year we kind of changed it just a little bit. So this year we focused on improving trust in local political coverage. And I think the first place I'd like to start is with the audience and hear what they have to say about trust.
If you're trying to push onto me what you believe,
sometimes they don't tell the story the way it is.
I want the truth. Like, as long as you're giving me the truth, the facts, the straight up facts.
You basically have to be a little skeptical about, what you hear and see on the news.
They're trying to be honest versus just trying to get a reaction, like covering the facts versus just what they think is going to rile people up.
Sometimes I feel like it's one-sided, and it doesn't cover like the whole basis of things.
Well, yeah, I still think there's just too much bias these days in news.
I don't trust most of them because most of them lie. They take this and cut in parts and out.
I think there's a very definitely a liberal bias in all levels of journalism, from local to national.
It's like maybe a lack of humanity, someone who's probably talking more like a robot than like an actual person.
We'll just say anything that seems more opinionated and not based in fact always makes me wary.
Just seeing how sometimes newsrooms can operate, there's very one-sided.
If their whole perspective is coming only from theirs, that's where I don't have as much trust for them.
So a little sobering. So just a few details here. We did this research in the U.S. in June 2023. The sample size was 2,000 people, 18 to 64, and it matched the demographics of the U.S. Everybody who participated had to consume local news and information on any platform at least once a week. So they were at least passing interest in local news. And, you might say, well, it's U.S., but what we often find is that Canada is 2 to 3, sometimes 5, but 2 to 3 years behind. And I think we all know that there's starting to be more polarization in Canada, and we're starting to see some of this vitriol, some of them directed at our lovely journalists on social, around trust. The other thing to just say, too, is this year we really wanted to focus on what does the audience think we can do to improve their trust. And I think there's some universal lessons from understanding and hearing those perspectives. So I'll start at the top. So the state of trust in 2023. So what we did is we asked the audience, is there ever a time when you use whatever the platform is, and wonder if you can trust the local news. And I'm underlining local because this is not about CNN versus Fox. In the U.S., local news is actually quite trusted, and local television news in particular always scores the highest on trust. So you'll see there, 67% of the sample said, yeah, I do wonder sometimes that if I can trust local news. 70% on web, and you can read across. The interesting thing here is we asked the same question last year, and TV was up 24% this year, radio was up 20% this year, and web was up 22%. So not only is the trust in local news devolving, it's also the rate at which people are losing trust in local news or starting to question, right? It's a fairly soft question on purpose. Are you wondering if you can trust it? So really there are three areas of focus that the audience told us that we should focus on when it comes to building trust around local news and politics. What's interesting is last year we didn't do politics. This year we focused on politics. And what I would say is many of the messages we heard last year are elevated, right? The amount of distrust is higher around political coverage. And political coverage is what we do and what some of us do a lot. So the lack of trust is elevated. So the three areas are topics, approach, and coverage, and we'll talk about topics first. And I think the important thing here is the audience is really clear about what are the topics that are interesting to them in terms of politics. And yet what the politicians talk about are not the same thing, right? So we really, really have to focus on, and this is what I think is so great about local politics, is it's different from city to city, town to town, even province to province, right? So really honing in on and being focused on what's important to your community, and don't let the politicians' talk tracks take you off that. So in this case, 63%, and I should just say we gave everybody a 1 to 10 score. These are the 8, 9, and 10 scores. So these are the sort of strongly agree. And typically we would say anything over 50% is strong, over 60% is extreme, right? So crime and safety, 63%, economy, 60%, healthcare, 57%. And if you hear politicians, certainly in the U.S., they're often talking about very divisive issues. They're still talking about the 2020 election. 2020 election, not on the list. They're more worried about having health care and roads.
Crime. I'm concerned about crime.
Crime sometimes. I get worried.
Crime right now is such a scary thing.
Obviously, it would be safety.
Just the safety of downtown in general.
Safety.
Crime.
What about the crime?
What about the crime?
Yeah.
You want to feel safe.
In my community right now, honestly, the roads are always having construction done. You can't get to where you're trying to go. Whenever you do try to get to where you're going, there's traffic everywhere.
Just having a stable living environment for most people.
Mainly inflation, housing costs. Those are kind of the big things that keep me up.
Public health is my first concern.
Definitely affordable housing or lack thereof, and rising cost of homes and rent, healthcare.
Cost of like housing, things of that nature.
Housing is a big one. Affordable housing, inflation, the economy.
And I'll just pause too to say you saw the prevalence of crime at the beginning of that clip. And what I would say is a lot of the research we've done across the U.S. shows that if you turn crime into safety, so if it's about solutions, if it's about things you can do, you see like up to a 25% increase in audience interest. So that's why I say crime and safety there, because people are really interested in keeping themselves and their families safe. So the second thing is approach. And I want to talk about 4 parts of approach. There's in-depth, our questions, balance, and transparency. So first on in-depth, the audience really responds. Remember, 50%, anything over 50 is strong, anything over 60 is extreme. They really respond well to fact-checking segment. Again, this is local sources working on politics. They really respond to the fact-checking segment. 58% hit the 8, 9, or 10 score. They want us to fact check candidates or politicians. 61% said that was very important. And 60% said that it was important that we explain complicated issues. And for those of you who have covered politics, there's often complicated issues. And this idea of explain has really come to the fore since COVID. People want to understand the world they live in. They want to understand, and not us telling them in a sort of preachy way, but they want to understand things. So they want, complicated pieces of legislation or the impact on them really explained. Questions really matter. People really want to see one-on-one interviews, and you'll see the theme through this is people want unvarnished, unedited access to your questions and the answers. So they respond well to one-on-one questions. They want to see you ask the same questions of all of the politicians. And again, this is what they say will build trust, because then they can compare the politicians for themselves. They want to see live interviews. Yay! TV does live interviews really well. So they want to see live interviews. Again, it's that idea that they want to see the unvarnished truth, and they want to see what the politicians have to say for them. Again, the reason I think this is important is because live interviews will build trust in you and in your stations. They really want us to ask tough questions, but those questions need to be respectful. And we see this in a lot of the qualitative research that we do. They want people to be held accountable, but those gotcha moments that do make good TV, you got to be careful. You got to be careful, right? Again, because what we're trying to do is build trust. Advocating and holding to account will build trust, but they want to know that you're going to be respectful. The third piece is balanced, not biased. So this idea of presenting all sides to political issues, I talk to a lot of my clients about this, particularly with the reporters, because sometimes we're quick to do two sides of a story when there's actually five. And what they say is, if you present all sides of political issues, 59% say that's very important, and they're more likely to trust you. They want to see balanced coverage of all sides of political issues. And finally, this idea of transparency. 52% want access to source materials. Now, you and I know if we put them on the web, will they go to them? Not with a ton of frequency, but they want to know that they're there. They want to know that you're providing the sources. They really think that transparency around our coverage decisions is very important. So 56% said very important. And really this is about, if you're going to air one interview or you only got one side, one politician on one side, why are we airing that interview before the other one? I also think making sure that the reporter is mic'd, hearing the question before the answer is another really great way to kind of push at this idea of transparency. So the more transparent you are about your editorial decisions, you heard in the last session about transparency with AI. So the more transparent we are, the more likely the audience is to trust you, which instead of continuing to see sort of trust devolve, we want to build it up. So 56% say transparency around coverage decisions. And the final thing is coverage. I think that it's going to be hard-pressed to say that you're going to get a return on your money in terms of the importance of political polling. We're talking political polling here. Because a little over a third say it's very valuable. A third of them say it's trustworthy, but the rest aren't that interested.
I think political polling is one of the stupidest things on the planet.
No, not at all. I don't know who made the polls up.
I don't really think that it matters. I think that no matter what the poll is, it shouldn't affect how people vote.
Sometimes polls say this and then the complete opposite candidate ends up winning, so.
Seems a little biased from what I've seen, and I've never been asked to participate in them, so I'm not sure how the random sampling works either.
I think it's a distraction from the issues that the country needs to face, and let's discuss what we need to do and worry less about the popularity.
The polls could definitely be wrong a lot of the time, too.
I do know polls can be misleading.
It's imperfect. I do trust it, but history has taught us that it doesn't always follow through.
I don't put as much stock in them
don't like it. I don't think many people who answer polls actually go in and vote the way they polled.
I would say my trust has eroded a little bit in recent years because you often hear that, that poll's not reliable, and then I think it depends where it was taken, when it was taken as well.
No, I'm just going to flat out say no.
So what I would say is, people do read polls, right? But when you're thinking about how do I build trust in our station, in our brand, in our journalism, the return on investment in polls is modest, I would say, modest. What's interesting, though, is your return on investment, and again, I'm just talking about trust here, the return on investment around debates, high. Again, it's that idea that even if your ratings aren't great, it really does build trust because it gives them unvarnished access to candidates. Here you'll see some of the we have a box where you can fill in your own sentiments, and it's important to hear the candidates' positions. Can you see you can get to see what politicians stand on? The interesting thing, because we do a lot of qualitative research with audiences as well, and you heard in the last clip, one of the guys said, I've never been called. And that is actually something that comes up quite a bit. If somebody hasn't been called, they're skeptical about when we say anonymous polling. And the other thing that comes out a lot is, I just want to talk about the issues. I don't care how other people are voting. I want to know what's happening with safety, what's happening with the infrastructure. That's what's going to shape my voting. So the return on investment, I would say, around debates is high when it comes to this idea of building trust. So the other thing that I think is really, really important, and we saw this in last year's research, is every journalist counts. And how I describe it is one bad apple is going to bring the whole station down. So 86% say if one journalist makes a mistake or failed to cover all sides of a political story, they are less likely to use that source overall. So one bad apple can take down the whole place. I think this is really, and this was true when we did it just about trust last year. So it's super important. And to the news leaders in the room, I would say making sure you have the right processes in place to ensure that we are balanced, that we're showing all sides, is becoming more and more important. So the 5 things I would say from this research that I would encourage everybody to start doing is, first, think about what is important to your community. Do not let the politicians set the agenda. Focus on the topics that people care about. And this is even more true when it comes to election time. Thing 2 is, if you don't have a fact-checking franchise, I'm telling you right now, it's going to go gangbusters. Go and build one. Even in a local market, people love fact-checking. Show your work. Be as transparent as you can around your work. Show sources. And the more you can be transparent in your storytelling, the more you're going to build trust in what you're doing. The 4th thing is build balance, accountability systems. That's what I was saying about the one bad apple can take down the whole place. Really make sure you have checks and balances in place in your newsrooms. And the final thing is substance over polls, right? People really want to see debates. They do want to get information about the topics that are important to them, but they're polls aren't going to drive trust. With that, I'll say thank you. And come hang with you.
So we'll just do a little bit of a chat, and then we'll invite the audience to join in with their own questions. This is sobering, actually, and a really good, interesting way to assess how we are doing and getting this feedback. And I know you mentioned Canada's generally a little bit behind the U.S., but I feel like we are, if you watch social media, we do seem to be entering that phase where we're almost as equally divided and about politics.
Yeah, and I think what we were trying to do is not just focus on the decrease in trust, but what we can do to build it back up, right? And as people become more skeptical, they want more access. They want to feel like it's unfettered, unedited, that they're seeing your questions, right? Like I say to every single station I work with, like mic both the report, you got to mic both people. We need to hear those questions, and you never know which question you're actually going to use.
Definitely. Actually, I do that in my stories all the time. I intentionally use my question so that the audience can see, the viewers can see what I actually asked and how the politician answers it.
Which gets even more interesting. I've been doing a lot of training recently around the art of the question. Because if you're going to show your question, it
better be good.
It better be good. And also it's such a delicate, there's so much nuance between holding them accountable and being disrespectful. And if the audience thinks you're being disrespectful, it decreases trust.
Definitely.
So it's a delicate balance.
Because I think if you're showing you're disrespectful, you're showing a bias.
Yes.
It looks like you have a bias against this politician.
Exactly.
Okay, fascinating. And I think it's so great to see what can we do to build that trust. Why do you think television appears to be the least trusted?
No, it was the most.
It's the most trusted.
It's the most
I'm
trusted.
sorry, I read that wrong.
The smaller the number on there, the better it is.
Okay.
So it is the most trusted. Generally, all of the digital platforms are, which you would understand why, are the least trusted. So it goes local television, then local radio, and then it actually goes into mobile app, and mobile app beats web, which is sort of interesting.
Very.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions and join in on this conversation?
There's one there. Microphone's coming to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So yeah, we heard a lot today about how young people tend to use social media more than news outlets. And I think a lot of the things that you mentioned that audiences want from news sources are already available on social media if you use it properly. Like, for example, they have access directly to candidates, political candidates and whatnot, and their direct statements. So do you think there's a way that journalists can, rather than competing with social media, do you think there's a way that we can use all those benefits to become more credible and gain audience trust?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I would say, so Gen Z is sort of lower on the rankings across all of the questions, but other than that, the demographics are pretty similar. And so when we look at those topics, Gen Z kind of fell out in the same shape as all the other demographics, just a titch lower. So I actually think that's great news. What I would say about social media is it's a tricky, especially in Canada, for obvious reasons. And I tend to think that you've got to use social media to gain awareness, but really where you're going to build loyalty is on your owned and operated platforms. It's interesting to show that trust in local news apps is higher than social media and YouTube. So I think that's interesting. And actually in Canada, from a Canadian perspective, that's good news, because there's been so many changes recently. So I would just say you've got to have content on social media, but it's not a distribution point. It's a marketing tool to bring them back to your owned and operated platforms. Liz. Yeah. Yeah, they did allude to it. So I think that's where transparency is your best friend, right? And I always say I call it process story language. How many people did you call? Who returned the call? What did you do to get that story? What are the documents? Show the documents, right? As much transparency around storytelling and fringe benefit, makes your storytelling more modern. But if you show and are transparent with as much as you possibly can, I think it shows that that your facts are there. But I do think that there's a critical thinking and rigor in our journalism we have to be really aware of. I had a client, just by way of example, who had this intersection where two young kids had been killed. There wasn't a traffic light there, so it was sort of a gotcha moment with the politician of why isn't there a traffic light there, right? But they never, which was the emotional question I think many people would have had. But there was none of the other parts of the story there. What would that do to the traffic flow? Have they studied it? How much would it cost, right? Like there's all these other things. And, you know, for the TV reporters in the room, they'll say, well, I can't do that in a $1.30 or 2-minute package, right? But I would say at least tipping your hand to the questions that you don't have answers to, the questions you've asked or that you're going to follow up tomorrow, even transparency in that process, Liz, I think helps build up the fact that we know there's questions that are going unanswered.
On?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's on. To pick up on Liz's point, I think obviously in the United States, and it's happening increasingly here in Canada, there is polarization. There's a whole swath of people, a third to maybe 40%, who think I speak for our business, we are BS. And we're fake and we're enemies. And I mean, I found it interesting watching all those clips. You know, there's some people who seem to have open minds to some degree. But how do you have any ideas or thoughts on how to maybe bring some of those people back into like the mainstream where facts live?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I would say trust in local television news, local, underline local, not network cable. Local television news is still very high in the U.S., and I would say they also tend to do quite balanced journalism, which is why it's sort of maintaining that. I think what I liked about the clips too is we were talking to people from all walks of life, from all socioeconomic, right? And I think it's important to consider that. I think the thing is, and we are starting to see a similar slide, which is what we were saying at the beginning, in Canada. And so I guess I feel a sense of urgency and a sense of fire in the belly for Canadians, for us to move now, right? To move dramatically and purposefully towards this idea of radical transparency in our storytelling. For not being dismissive of people who say, oh, well, fake news. Like, I'm in lots of newsrooms where it's like, oh, yeah, they're just going to say it's fake news. But the people you saw are real people, and they're thoughtful, and they have, and their trust is devolving. So for me, I feel like it's a sense of urgency around, and political is the most extreme, which is why we actually study that, and there's an election coming up in the U.S. So I think really for me it's around transparency, thinking about the processes that need to be in place to really make sure that we're covering all of the sides of each of the story. So it just gives me that sense of urgency. I feel like if we move now, we can kind of stem the slide.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Here we go. You'd think I'd know how to use a microphone. Really quick question. I think transparency is obviously key in terms of earning that trust. I'm curious to know, based on other organizations you've spoken to, what are some of the methods to provide that transparency? We talk about $1.30 on television, only a certain amount of words within the course of a story online. How do you go about providing that in addition to the story itself?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that $1.30 shouldn't be a hard and fast rule, so I would say that first. But a lot of what we're trying to do with our clients is use the anchors as a way of adding context and perspective after a package, so adding some facts and using that. I would say the storytelling of how a reporter is actually showing their story is something that we're working a lot on, so that idea of miking the questions and including those questions. Okay, we can't use all of the questions because time is really of the essence. But I think, I think that there are ways to use both the anchor as a storyteller as you go into a package and out of a package that can add value. And, I just came back from a pretty impoverished city in the U.S. Yesterday, and that's because poverty is such a big thing. They put tons of resources online. So they do put their source material online, but they have like domestic violence resources. They have how to save money resources, what to do if you have a crummy landlord resources. So they're trying to become almost like a community hub and the place that people will go for help. So that's another way to, it's not really transparency, but it's that idea that we're here to help you. Like, we care. We're part of your community. What can we do to help you? I think that's a one good way.
Promoting that angle of, what about marketing and promoting that angle of your newscasts?
Yeah, so the last time a guy said, trust me, I was like, So I'm actually, I'm not a big fan of marketing being like telling me to trust you isn't going to work, right? The proof has to be in the product. So I would say doing marketing around stories that we broke and how we broke them and the investigative or in-depth journalism we did to get that story, I think there's value there. But I'm not a big fan of promos that are like, trust us, because I don't think the audience who is already skeptical is really going to believe that message. So really, I think the proof is in the product, and how you show that proof is going to be your best friend.
I would hope we'd be more subtle than that.
I think we are good. Good. Yeah. Thank you so very much, Marissa. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
interesting. Thank you. I will definitely take your words to heart. So we have Jamie Watt joining us shortly. If you just give us a few moments, and I'm sure many of you know who he is, but if you ever get into trouble, he's the person to call.